Boy falls in love with girl. Boy marries girl. Girl cuts off boy's penis.
Trouble was huge.
Court TV is bringing the proceedings into millions of homes.
People were like, holy shit.
The world was gripped when Lorena Bobbitt went on trial for chopping off her husband's male genitalia in 1993. But Lorena wasn't the first or the last to commit such an act. Her case, however, captivated the public imagination like no other, becoming a media sensation that sparked heated debates about domestic violence, marital rape, and gender roles in America. It was a warm summer night in Manassas, Virginia, on June 23, 1993. The kind of night where the air hangs heavy and still, pregnant with possibility. In a small apartment on Maplewood Drive, 24-year-old Lorena Bobbitt lay awake next to her sleeping husband, John Wayne Bobbit. The steady sound of his breathing filled the darkened bedroom. Lorena's mind raced, replaying the events of the past 4 years of her turbulent marriage. The arguments, the physical abuse, the sexual assaults. She claimed John had raped her earlier that very evening. Now, as she gazed at his sleeping form, something inside her snapped. Moving silently, Lorena slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen. The linoleum was cool beneath her bare feet as she opened a drawer and withdrew a gleaming 8-inch carving knife. Its weight felt solid and purposeful in her hand. Returning to the bedroom, Lorena stood over her husband for a long moment. Then, in one swift motion, she pulled back the sheet and brought the knife down. With a single slice, she severed John Wayne Bobbitt's male genitalia from his body. John awoke with a start, crying out in shock and agony. But Lorena was already fleeing the apartment, still clutching the knife in one hand and her husband's severed organ in the other. She got into her car and sped off into the night, tossing the male genitalia out the window as she drove. It was a moment that would captivate the nation and spark a media frenzy unlike anything seen before. The Lorena Bobbitt case was about to become a cultural touchstone of the 1990s. To understand how things escalated to such a shocking act, we need to go back to the beginning of John and Lorena's relationship. The two met in 1988 at a bar near the Quantico Marine Corps base in Virginia. John was a 21-year-old lance corporal in the Marines, brash and self-assured. Lorena was just 19, an Ecuadorian immigrant working as a manicurist and dreaming of a better life in America. For Lorena, John represented the promise of the American dream, a handsome Marine who could provide stability and security. John was attracted to Lorena's beauty and gentle nature. After a whirlwind courtship, the two married in 1989. But cracks in the relationship appeared almost immediately. John expected a docile, submissive wife who would cater to his needs. Lorena hoped for a caring partner to build a life with. Neither found what they were looking for. Arguments became frequent and often turned physical. Lorena would later testify that John began beating her just weeks into their marriage. She described being punched, choked, and thrown against walls. John vehemently denied these allegations. The violence was compounded by financial troubles. John struggled to hold down jobs after leaving the Marines. The couple fought constantly over money. Lorena claimed that John stole her earnings and spent them on himself, leaving her with nothing. But the most serious allegations involved sexual abuse. Lorena said that John repeatedly raped her throughout their marriage, forcing himself on her even when she begged him to stop. She described feeling like a sex object for her husband, expected to submit to his demands no matter what. As the abuse escalated, Lorena sank into depression. She felt trapped and hopeless, unable to leave the marriage due to financial dependence and fears about her immigration status. Something had to give. In the early hours of June 23, 1993, that powder keg finally exploded. After severing her husband's male genitalia, Lorena drove away in a panic. She found herself on Maplewood Drive, where she flung the severed organ out her car window. Realizing the enormity of what she'd done, Lorena called 911. "I have a problem," she told the dispatcher. "My husband abused me, and I cut off his male genitalia." Meanwhile, a badly bleeding John Bobbit was rushed to the hospital. Police launched a frantic search for the missing appendage, knowing that every minute counted if there was to be any hope of reattachment. In a stroke of luck, they found it in the grass along Maplewood Drive. Officer Todd Ehrlich carefully placed it in a hot dog bag filled with ice from a nearby 7-Eleven. Thus began a race against time to save John Bobbitt's manhood. At Prince William Hospital, a team of skilled microsurgeons led by Dr. James Sen and Dr. David Berman worked for over 9 hours to reattach the severed male genitalia. It was a delicate procedure requiring them to reconnect tiny blood vessels and nerve endings. Against the odds, the surgery was a success. John Bobbit would regain full function of his male genitalia, a medical miracle that only added to the sensational nature of the case. As John recuperated, Lorena was arrested and charged with malicious wounding. The stage was set for a trial that would rivet the nation. News of the Bobbit case spread like wildfire, igniting a media firestorm. Here was a story that seemed stranger than fiction, a wronged wife taking revenge in the most shocking way imaginable. The case tapped into deep cultural anxieties about gender, sex, and power. For some, Lorena was a feminist avenger, striking back against male violence and domination. For others, she was a deranged woman who had committed an unconscionable act. Late-night comedians had a field day with jokes about John's misfortune. The case spawned countless puns and double entendres. Bobbitized entered the lexicon as a verb meaning to castrate. Even normally staid news anchors struggled to keep straight faces while reporting on the story. The media coverage often focused on the more salacious aspects of the case, turning it into a tawdry spectacle. Lost in much of the reporting were the serious issues of domestic violence that lay at the heart of the matter. As the Bobbits prepared to face off in court, America tuned in, captivated by this modern-day soap opera playing out in real time. In November 1993, John Bobbit went on trial for marital sexual assault. Taking the stand in his own defense, he vehemently denied ever abusing his wife. He painted a picture of Lorena as unstable and jealous, claiming she attacked him because he wanted a divorce. The jury ultimately found John not guilty, citing lack of evidence. But his ordeal was far from over. In January 1994, it was Lorena's turn to face justice as her trial for malicious wounding began. The media circus reached a fever pitch, with news vans and reporters swarming the courthouse in Manassas. Over 7 days of emotional testimony, the details of the Bobbits' troubled marriage were laid bare. Lorena took the stand to recount years of alleged abuse, sexual assault, and emotional torment at John's hands. Her lawyers argued that she had been pushed to the breaking point, suffering from clinical depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. "I was afraid of him," Lorena testified tearfully. "I felt I had no choice." The prosecution painted a different picture, arguing that Lorena was a vindictive woman who had committed a premeditated act of vengeance. They questioned why she had never reported the alleged abuse to authorities. In the end, the jury sided with Lorena. On January 21, 1994, they found her not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The courtroom erupted in gasps as the verdict was read. Lorena was ordered to undergo a 45-day evaluation at a psychiatric hospital, after which she would be free. As she left the courthouse, supporters cheered while others decried the verdict as a miscarriage of justice. The trial may have been over, but the debate it sparked was just beginning. The Bobbit case landed at a crucial moment in America's ongoing conversation about gender, power, and violence. It became a Rorschach test, with people projecting their own views and anxieties onto it. For many feminists, Lorena's acquittal was a victory. They saw her as a symbol of female rage against patriarchal oppression, a woman who had finally fought back against her abuser. The case shone a spotlight on the hidden epidemic of domestic violence and marital rape. Others viewed the verdict as an example of anti-male bias in the justice system. They questioned how a woman could avoid punishment for such a violent act, seeing it as tacit approval of vigilantism. The case exposed a deep gender divide in how the public perceived the Bobbits. Polls showed women were far more likely to sympathize with Lorena, while men tended to side with John. Beyond the serious debates, the Bobbit saga saturated pop culture. It inspired countless jokes, skits, and parodies. Bobbit became shorthand for castration fears. The case was referenced everywhere from Saturday Night Live to Seinfeld. For better or worse, John and Lorena Bobbitt became household names, a notoriety that would follow them long after the trial ended. In the years following the trial, John and Lorena took very different paths. John Bobbit attempted to capitalize on his infamy, starring in adult films with titles like John Wayne Bobbit Uncut. He had several run-ins with the law, including arrests for domestic violence against subsequent partners. His life seemed to spiral into a series of bad decisions and missed opportunities. Lorena, meanwhile, kept a lower profile. She reverted to using her maiden name, Gallo, and focused on rebuilding her life. She underwent therapy to deal with the trauma of her past and became an advocate for domestic violence survivors. In 2007, Lorena founded Lorena's Red Wagon, an organization dedicated to preventing domestic violence through family-oriented activities. She found purpose in using her story to help others escape abuse. As the years passed, public perception of the case began to shift. In the era of #MeToo, many reassessed Lorena's actions through the lens of surviving prolonged abuse. What had once been treated as a tawdry joke was now seen by many as a tragic story of domestic violence. In 2019, Jordan Peele produced a 4-part documentary series titled Lorena, which re-examined the case with a more nuanced, empathetic approach. It allowed Lorena to tell her side of the story in full for the first time. "They always just focused on it," Lorena said, referring to the male genitalia. "And it's like they all missed or didn't care why I did what I did." The documentary sparked renewed discussion about how the media had sensationalized the story at the expense of addressing the serious issues at its core. For Lorena, revisiting that traumatic period was difficult but ultimately cathartic. "I'll put myself through the jokes and everything as long as I can shine a light on domestic violence and sexual assault and marital rape," she said. Now in her 50s, Lorena has found happiness with her longtime partner and their daughter. She continues her advocacy work, speaking out against domestic violence and supporting other survivors. John Bobbitt's life has been more troubled. He has struggled with substance abuse issues and continued legal problems. In a 2019 interview, he maintained his innocence regarding Lorena's abuse allegations, saying, "I don't know why she did what she did." Looking back on the Bobbit case from the vantage point of 2024, what lessons can we draw? How has our understanding of domestic violence, trauma, and gender dynamics evolved? One clear takeaway is the importance of taking domestic violence allegations seriously. In the early 1990s, marital rape was still not recognized as a crime in all 50 states. The Bobbit case helped bring these issues into the national conversation, even if much of the nuance was lost in the sensationalized coverage. The case also highlights how trauma can drive people to extreme acts. While Lorena's actions were shocking, they emerged from a context of prolonged abuse and helplessness. Understanding this context is crucial to addressing the root causes of domestic violence. Media coverage of such sensitive issues has also evolved. While sensationalism still exists, there is generally more awareness of the need to report responsibly on domestic violence and sexual assault. Survivors' voices are centered more often in these stories. Perhaps most importantly, the Bobbit case reminds us of the human beings behind the headlines. Two troubled people became punchlines and caricatures. Their pain turned into entertainment for the masses. Reassessing the case today requires seeing John and Lorena as complex individuals shaped by their experiences and traumas. The story of John and Lorena Bobbitt is, at its core, a tragedy, a cautionary tale of how unaddressed trauma and abuse can lead to shocking violence. It's a story of how media sensationalism can obscure important issues, and it's a story that continues to resonate and provoke debate decades later. As Lorena Gallo reflected in a recent interview, "I didn't choose to be in the public eye. What happened to me, it shook me to the core. But if by sharing my story I can help even one person escape an abusive situation, then perhaps some good can come from all the pain. The cultural earthquake set off by that fateful night in 1993 continues to reverberate today. The Bobbit case forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, gender, and justice. While we've made progress in many ways, these issues remain as relevant as ever. As we look back on this shocking story that captured the world's attention, perhaps the most important takeaway is this: behind every sensational headline are real human beings with real pain. In rushing to judgment or turning trauma into entertainment, we risk losing sight of our shared humanity. The Bobbit case, in the end, is a reminder to approach even the most shocking stories with empathy, nuance, and compassion. But the Bobbit case wasn't just about two individuals. It was a mirror held up to American society, reflecting our attitudes towards gender, power, and violence. The public reaction to the case revealed deep-seated biases and misconceptions about domestic abuse and its victims. Many were quick to judge Lorena, seeing her act as one of vengeful madness rather than desperate self-defense. The jokes and snickering comments that proliferated in the media often portrayed her as a crazed, knife-wielding woman, a caricature that obscured the reality of her situation. On the other hand, John Bobbit, despite the allegations against him, was often portrayed sympathetically in the media. His lost manhood became a source of public fascination and even sympathy, overshadowing the serious abuse allegations against him. This disparity in public perception highlighted the challenges faced by domestic violence survivors in being believed and taken seriously. It underscored how society often minimizes or dismisses claims of abuse, particularly when they occur within the confines of marriage. The Bobbit case also brought attention to the issue of marital rape, a concept that many Americans at the time still found difficult to grasp. In 1993, marital rape had only recently been criminalized in all 50 states, and many people still held the outdated belief that a husband couldn't rape his wife. Lorena's allegations of repeated sexual assault by John forced the public to confront the reality of marital rape. It challenged the notion that marriage gave a husband unlimited sexual access to his wife, regardless of her consent. The case also highlighted the unique vulnerabilities faced by immigrant women in abusive relationships. Lorena, as a young immigrant, faced additional barriers to leaving her abusive situation. She feared deportation and was financially dependent on John. Her story shed light on how immigration status can be used as a tool of control by abusive partners. As the years passed, the Bobbit case continued to evolve in the public consciousness. What was once seen primarily as a salacious tabloid story began to be re-examined through a more critical lens. The rise of the #MeToo movement in the late 2010s prompted many to revisit the Bobbit case with fresh eyes. Lorena's story was now seen in the context of a broader societal reckoning with sexual assault and abuse of power. This shift in perspective was reflected in the 2019 documentary series Lorena, produced by Jordan Peele. The series aimed to reframe the narrative around the case, focusing on the issues of domestic violence and sexual assault that had been overshadowed by sensationalism in the original media coverage. The documentary allowed Lorena to tell her story in her own words, providing a nuanced portrayal of her experiences. It explored the systemic failures that left her feeling trapped and helpless in an abusive marriage, where her pleas for help were met with skepticism and disregard. It revealed how societal norms often protect perpetrators while silencing victims, illustrating the profound isolation Lorena faced. By revisiting her story, the documentary sought to foster a deeper understanding of the complexities of domestic violence, emphasizing the need for systemic change and greater support for survivors. Ultimately, it reinforced the importance of listening to and believing those who endure such trauma, urging viewers to confront the uncomfortable truths about abuse that linger in society today. While Lorena's actions came from deep distress, experts emphasized that violence is never a solution to abuse. Instead, she could have sought support from friends or shelters, worked with therapists who specialize in trauma, or explored legal options like restraining orders. This case raises complex questions about guilt and responsibility. Many argue that the real failures lie within a system that often overlooks domestic violence, leaving victims feeling trapped. It's essential to consider not only Lorena's actions, but also the broader societal issues that allowed her situation to escalate. What are your thoughts on this perspective? Do you think the focus should be on individual actions or the systemic failures that contribute to such situations?